Good evening. My name is Reshat Kasaba. I am the director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture, which is jointly sponsored by the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. Tonight, we are honored by the presence of our distinguished guest and featured speaker, Robert Gallucci, the president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Dr. Gallucci's resume is long and very impressive, and it is not very easy to summarize. He has followed a number of careers, and some of them concurrently, and they overlapped. And over the years, these different lines, different pursuits have fed into each other, have reinforced each other, and have strengthened each other. I think what's truly remarkable is that he has succeeded in reaching the pinnacle of success in each and every one of them. Starting in 1974, Dr. Gallucci worked in the U.S. Department of State for more than 20 years. He served the department in different capacities. In 1992, he was appointed the senior coordinator responsible for non-proliferation and nuclear safety initiatives in the former Soviet Union. And later that year, he was confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. In 1994, Dr. Gallucci was appointed as Ambassador at Large. In 1998, he was named Special Envoy to deal with the threat posed by the proliferation of ballistic missiles and weapons of mass destruction. In addition to the former Soviet Union, his work took him to all the interesting areas in the world, including the Middle East and East Asia. He was the chief U.S. negotiator with North Korea during the nuclear crisis of 1994. As you will remember, months of these tense negotiations resulted in the agreed framework of 1994, which was the first time North Korea engaged with Western powers on issues related to nuclear weapons. Dr. Gallucci's second career is in academia. He has a PhD in political science from Brandeis University. He has taught at several institutions, including Swarthmore College, Johns Hopkins University, and Georgetown University. He has published books and influential articles, and most importantly, he served as the dean of Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service for 13 years between 1996 and 2009. Dr. Gallucci became the president of the MacArthur Foundation in 2009. As we know, this is one of the largest independent foundations in the United States. It has an annual grant-making capacity of more than $200 million, and it plays an important role in supporting scientific inquiry and fostering the development of knowledge in social sciences, natural sciences, arts, humanities, professional fields, and policy areas. Dr. Gallucci's lecture tonight is part of a year-long series the Jackson School is sponsoring, where we are taking stock of our world in the post-9/11 environment. Our topic tonight is nuclear weapons and disarmament in a changing world. And it is hard to imagine a person more appropriate and qualified than our guest, Dr. Robert Gallucci, to address this issue. Without further ado, I am pleased to invite him to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rasat. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you to the Jackson School, to the Jackson Foundation. I'm going to speak to you tonight and try to stay in a reasonable amount of time so that there's opportunity for questions and discussion. As I was thinking about this, was thinking about a speaker we had at MacArthur just a little bit ago. It was we call it convening on hyperconcentration of wealth. And this is a professor from Yale. And we had given him a piece of time to talk, and he said, I'm only going to take about a quarter of the time you allotted to me. And that's because of something that happened to me this past summer. He said that actually at graduation, a student of his had come up to him who was graduating and said that he wanted this professor to know that if he had only 5 minutes left to live in his life, he would like to spend those 5 minutes in one of his classes. And the professor said he was just stunned by this, and he should have just remained stunned. Instead, he asked why. And the student said, because it would feel like so much longer. The topic that I agreed to speak on is nuclear weapons and disarmament in a changing world. And I'm actually going to kind of broaden that out a bit to more something like understanding the national security with the role of nuclear weapons, disarmament, and arms control in a changing world as sort of part of the national security. I know you think you just heard enough about me, but I want to go back over some of that to, in one sense, demonstrate my credibility to take on a topic of such scope, and also to give you another take on one's career in government service. So I went into government service 40 years ago, roughly, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency as a foreign affairs officer, and I had given to me a specific mission. That mission was to make sure that Pakistan never acquired nuclear weapons. I think we all know how that turned out. About a decade later, I'd worked on this for a while, I was the Deputy Director General of a peacekeeping force in the Sinai known as the Multinational Force and Observers, and my mission at the MFO was to bring a warm peace to Israel and Egypt. I think we know where we are on that one. 4 years after that, I was a Deputy Executive Chairman of something called UNSCOM, the UN Special Commission, charged with the disarmament of Iraq after the first Gulf War, and my mission was to make sure we don't have any reason ever to fight in Iraq again. My fourth major mission, when I became an Assistant Secretary of State, was to take on the job of leading reactor safety assistance to the former Soviet Union, and my job was to make sure we did not have to worry about any fissile material or nuclear weapons scientists ever leaving Russia. Think about that. My fifth major mission were those negotiations with North Korea, where I will note my job was to make sure that North Korea never got nuclear weapons. Then I left government and was undoubtedly brought back because of this sterling record. And I was a special envoy, and I was charged with the mission of making sure that Russia didn't provide any assistance to Iran in ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons, and that Iran would never approach a nuclear weapons program. So I'd like to make 4 points about this. The first is that this is arguably an unbroken record of diplomatic failure. The second, as one of my colleagues said, it is the triumph of experience over performance. The third is that after each one of these assignments, I was promoted. And my fourth point is this a great country or what? So what I propose to talk about with that objective of talking about the national security over time is the evolution of the international environment through 3 specific periods. The first period, we can call these anything we want. I've called it early period, classical period, the first 150 years of the nation's history. The second, the middle period, because it's in the middle, a post-war period, change in international structure, critical changes in technology and innovation, and this lasts about 40 years. And then the last period, the current period, sort of the post-war world, another change in international structure, another evolution in technology, and we're about 20 years into this third period. The elements of each period, it has always seemed to me, changed, but some of them stayed on and still defined the next period and the one after that. Another way to look at it is if you look at our current situation, the roots of security realities, including arms control and disarmament, in 2012 really extend back to 1789. This is, for those of you who are interested in and do international theory, IR theory, this is a realist approach you will recognize. So phase one, and this goes from the beginning of the Republic till about 1950, is a period when classically the power of a nation state is defined by its industrial capacity, by its natural and human resources, by its military strength, its mobility, and its naval power, and finally by geography. For U.S. national security, the implications of this were that America from the beginning would have an interest, a vital interest, in opposing hegemony in Europe and in Asia and in the Middle East, and would have an interest in imposing hegemony in Latin America. This, I would submit to you, still drives U.S. national security policy. It did certainly for World War I and World War II, opposing German hegemony, Japanese hegemony. It is part of the Cold War calculation that we experienced for those decades. It's part of the concern that we now have about Iran and acquisition of nuclear weapons, and it is more than part of, it is central to our concerns now about a rising or a risen China. But for the first 150 years, U.S. geography was key. We had oceans on either side. We had a competent navy eventually, and we had no real threats on land from north or south. No war that we fought, one could argue, was necessary. Threats to vital interests, to the national security of the United States, really didn't exist, and so we fought wars of expansion. Well, we have a little asterisk here, be 1813 when the British were rude enough to burn Washington. But if we just put that aside, then we have a long period of almost 150 years here in which we enjoy this incredible isolation from threat. United States provided for its defense by what strategists called a defense by denial. We were actually capable of denying access to the continental United States, something we now sometimes call CONUS, entirely, so that we could not be touched if we wished not to be touched. Evidence of this is found by the late entry of the United States into World War I, where we agonized over that, by the interwar period when interventionists and isolationists argued, and then ultimately by a rather slow entry into the Second World War, speeded, of course, by the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's the imagery I would have for the first period of American security. Phase two, or the adjusted classical paradigm, goes from about 1950 for me to around 1990 or so. It's marked principally by first a change in international structure, and what I mean by that is just simply the distribution of power in the world. It's been described lots of different ways, but simply by a bipolar world, the United States and the Soviet Union, sometimes said to produce a zero-sum view of international politics in which whatever we lose, they gain. And when you have that imagery of competition, vital interests all of a sudden are everywhere. Instead of vital interests being just the continental United States, there is nothing that happens which doesn't seem to somehow be vital to U.S. security. It is the security less of a nation state and more of an empire. So structure is an important change. The second change was in technology. And in technology, we had two very important changes, neither of them rhetorical in the same way that bipolar world was rhetorical. These were substantive changes. The first was the development of the atomic bomb and then the thermonuclear weapon. Paired with that was the development of ballistic missiles, from the V-2, a true ballistic missile, as opposed to the V-1, onto intercontinental ballistic missiles. The mating of these two meant two things. One weapon, one city. 5 weapons, one nation. Ballistic missiles meant no defense by denial. We had no way of preventing missiles armed with nuclear weapons from landing on our territory. No defense by denial. It wasn't possible in 1945, it wasn't possible in 1950, and I would submit to you it's not possible in 2012. That we cannot prevent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 missiles with any confidence from landing on American territory. No defense by denial. Instead, we replaced defense by denial with deterrence. And deterrence was a psychological concept. Fear of punishment, fear of retaliation is supposed to deter an enemy from attacking us. So instead of a physical defense, the Navy, the oceans, this kind of Army and Navy physical, we had replaced this with a psychological concept which had a lot of uncertainties about it. Still does, and that's the relevance here. We had come to the point of not knowing really the limits of deterrence, what it really meant. Does deterrence work on crazy people, for example? Now, that was not a silly question. Did it work on Khrushchev? Well, sort of yes, and then he took his shoe off at the UN, pounded on the table, and we said, I wonder if we can really deter him. I wonder if his calculation is the kind of calculation that we can really impact. What about any one of the last 3 Kims? Does deterrence work on these guys? Does deterrence work on Ahmadinejad? Something we may have to look into more carefully. Can you extend deterrence? Can you defend your ally by promising to attack an enemy if the enemy attacks your ally? Does that really work? Very important for alliances. How much punishment do you have to be able to mete out before someone is deterred? Destroy 1 city, 10 cities? We developed all kinds of metrics of what percentage of industrial capacity and population we needed to be able to destroy with a residual offensive capability after we calculated what the enemy would destroy in their first strike on us, and then hoped that that would have the necessary impact on the psychology of the attackers such that they would be deterred. And then if you can discourage a first strike against you by deterrence, can you discourage retaliation by deterrence by promising that if someone responds to your attack, you will attack them and destroy what's left? And if you can, is deterrence possible at all? Can you attack the capacity to retaliate and prevent deterrence entirely? All these questions led to extraordinary development and competition in weaponry. Second strike meant you had to have survivable systems, which led to the triad. The idea that that wasn't enough, that maybe you needed a first strike capability to disarm your enemy, led to the enormous arms race and the number of weapons we developed. When does a threat to retaliate become non-credible, leaving a nation completely defenseless? This is a very live issue, was through this middle period and is today. It really is the question of the force to frap. When we were developing our systems and we were engaged with an umbrella over NATO, the French said, we will develop a very small nuclear force. It is a force to frap, because all it takes to deter is an ability to destroy a few cities. That's all. Interesting proposition. Is it true? If it is true, then those who argue now for much lower levels and for minimum deterrence have a good point. If it's not true and you have a genuine enemy, you're screwed. So the question is, how much does it take to deter? This psychological set of questions that all go to if we think this and they think that, what are the implications for our force structure? Also led to another phenomenon, and that was the constant drive to recapture old-fashioned defense by denial. Something substantial that wasn't psychological, something physical we could do. And that led to the development of thinking about missile defense. In the 60s, that was the ABM. In the 80s, that was Star Wars. And in the 90s, and until now, still is ballistic missile defense, whatever architecture we happen to be pursuing at the moment. And when you look back in the 1960s, there are a couple of people old enough to remember this, you might remember the Spartan and Sprint systems. Spartan system was supposed to go up if the Soviets attacked over the pole, we would send up Spartan missiles first with nuclear warheads. Exo-atmospherically, they would detonate and destroy the incoming offensive missiles. If any missiles got through, then we had sprints. They would go up and detonate nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, killing the remaining incoming weapons. Now, we thought this was a terrific architecture. The Canadians really didn't like it that much. Right? It's sort of go figure, you know. If you look at Star Wars really was a theory. There really were no systems in Star Wars. A colleague of mine observed that through the 80s, the Soviets deployed extremely large throw-weight missiles, the SS-9s and SS-18s. An extraordinary number. They MIRVed them with multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, an incredible offensive force. That's what they deployed. We deployed, in response, view graphs of Star Wars, and we won at the end of that, which says something about the psychology of all this. Two things, or two implications, or kinds of enthusiasm came out of all this. The first was an enthusiasm to manage nuclear weapons competition. You might say the vertical competition where you add to your capability between the Soviet Union and the United States. There was an abandonment of simple disarmament as being inadequate. Simply reducing the number of missiles was not going to give us security. Instead, we looked to arms control, which really was a concept meant to indicate that we were going to manage the competition. We were going to value stability at as low a level as we could have. But stability was the test, reducing the incentive to strike first or the surprise attack. And it was aimed at all levels of forces to get down to a stable relationship. The idea was stop arms races, among other things. This explains SALT I, 1972, SALT II, START I, START II, START III, SORT, and New START. Now, New START's the latest one. I could go through those and tell you what each provided, but I'd like somebody to be left at the end of this, and so I won't do that. But that arms control history reflects a response to the tensions and the ambiguity, in my view, of that period, of this middle period. The second enthusiasm was to manage the other competition. That was the vertical competition. The other was the horizontal competition, and that was to do something about the spread, or as some said, the proliferation of nuclear weapons to additional states. That led to the IAEA and its safeguards regime, intended to make nuclear energy safe from the acquisition of nuclear weapons. The various test bans, the limited test ban treaty, forcing testing underground, the threshold test ban treaty limiting the yield, even if it was underground, and then the comprehensive test ban treaty, which is not entered into force in no small part because we have not adhered to it. It also meant the Nuclear Suppliers Group, where countries with the technology agreed to be careful about how they exported it, and it also led, importantly, to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is virtually universal. The 5 nuclear weapon states, the United States, Russia, France, Britain, and China all belong, and the only states in the whole world that don't belong, essentially, are India, Pakistan, Israel, and then there's the question of whether North Korea is or is not in the regime. So that's pretty extraordinary, and that, you should note, accounts for the incorrect predictions of the 1960s. In the 1960s, looking ahead, before all these things were really in place, projections were that there would be 90 nuclear weapon states by the turn of the century. They were off by exactly one order of magnitude. There are 9 right now. So we leave phase 2 and we move into phase 3, which is a further adjusted paradigm of the first 2. Goes, from my calculation, from about 1990 up to the present day. So we're 20 years into this third phase. Again, a change in international structure. The Soviet Union falls. It's no longer a bipolar world. What kind of world is it? I don't know, but certainly it's a distribution of power that favors the United States. Is it a unipolar moment? Are we still in it? Is it over? We can go there. That to me isn't terribly interesting, but certainly it favors the United States. We are still concerned about deterrence. We're still doing arms control agreements with the Russians now. They are bilateral. We are still concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons to other states. We have focused, however, really on 2 states, and that is Iran. Those are Iran and North Korea. And interestingly, we have one situation where deterrence meets non-proliferation, and that would be the relationship between India and Pakistan, where for most of us who look at these things is the one place on the earth, South Asia, where we can see quite plausibly a nuclear exchange taking place between 2 countries, intentionally, without an accidental or an unauthorized launch. But now there are 2 new developments in international security in this phase 3 to be noted to characterize it. The first is the damage that could be done to the international community by the catastrophic degradation of the environment from the extraction of resources, the expansion of agriculture, increases in population, pressures for development, all of which lead to the destruction of very fragile ecosystems, undercutting biodiversity, often exacerbated by climate change. Think here of the massive environmental impact that China has and the private corporations of the West in extracting resources in Africa and elsewhere in the global South. Think of the dams built in Southeast Asia and the impact on water supply. Think about the billions of barrels of oil beneath the Lake Albert region of Uganda and how it will be extracted and at what cost. Think about the impact of African palm oil plantations everywhere, or massive overfishing, or deforestation of primary growth forests, et cetera, et cetera. My argument here is that the threat to near-term local populations and long-term to the planet is significant. The latter because of the interconnectedness, the interdependence, economic and political, of a globalized world. It is the magnitude of the impact of the threat that turns the threat to our environment into a national and an international security issue. That, I would argue to you, is new. The second development is that a non-national actor, clumsy phrase, but bear with me, a non-national actor may cause catastrophic loss of life and threaten the national security and international security by gaining access to nuclear weapons or biological weapons. You may shorthand this, if you wish, to biological warfare, biological terrorism, or nuclear terrorism, provided you don't do that and think only of an external actor like Al-Qaeda. Think also of the internal actor. Think of Oklahoma City in the United States. Think of the anthrax mailer, whomever that may actually have been. Let's talk about the nuclear threat first. This is not the traditional threat from a nuclear weapons state. There is no defense against the threat I'm defining for you. No defense by denial. We cannot secure our borders against the introduction of a nuclear weapon, period. We may get lucky from time to time, but not with any confidence. The issue is not that. You can't have a defense of our country against the threat by saying, I'll catch them before they come across the border, because of all the ways the enemy can come across the border. I always like to point something I see frequently, which is I see mariners a lot on the East Coast, a lot, I'm sure here I see mariners. Think about mariners. Notice how they're patrolled constantly by the Coast Guard. Nobody, no, they're not. Right? So you can go on from there, if you will. I have a colleague who said, if you want to introduce a nuclear weapon in the United States, put it in a bale of marijuana, it's bound to get in. Whatever is your favorite image, no defense by denial. What about deterrence? First of all, in my scenario of nuclear terrorism, you're not really sure who did it. Any number of people may take credit. If you don't know who did it when something happens and they think they can attack you without you finding out who did it, you really can't deter them psychologically. Second, if a terrorist values your death more than their life, they're not a real good candidate for deterrence. Right? So there's a problem here. What are the most worrisome scenarios? And are any of them more than just possible? Are any of them more likely plausible? And over time, are any of them probable? I've got two scenarios for you. First, the acquisition of a nuclear weapon by a terrorist group. Under most circumstances, I would say this is only just barely possible because all states with nuclear weapons tend to take good care of them, and lock them up and count them and all that. But we do have the case of Pakistan. Pakistan has a growing inventory of nuclear weapons based both on plutonium and highly enriched uranium. It has multiple delivery systems that it's developing, and it is very concerned about the United States finding their weapons after what we demonstrated we could do when we got Osama bin Laden in their country. They're very concerned about the Indians knowing where the weapons are. So the weapons are not secured to a standard which we regard as adequate. They're secured in a way so that they can be constantly on the move. There is in Pakistan an insider threat that is greater than any other that I know of on the planet. So all these weapons, inadequately secured with an insider threat, to me, make this a very uniquely troubling circumstance. So I would say, generally speaking, the nuclear weapons scenario is not a great one to be worried about, except for Pakistan, which is a pretty huge exception. Scenario 2 I find much more concerning, and that's the acquisition of fissile material by a terrorist group, and then that group fabricating an improvised nuclear device, or what they call in the biz an IND. I find this somewhere between plausible and probable over time. If it's highly enriched uranium, they find, and they can use, that they get their hands on, they can build a very simple device called a gun-type design. It's essentially just a tube with high explosives placed here and there, and highly enriched uranium in certain shapes placed inside. It's so simple that as the design we used on Hiroshima, we didn't bother testing it first. We just dropped it on Hiroshima and got 12, 13 kilotons of yield. The other design requires plutonium, and that's a more complicated design. It's called an implosion system. Might get you more yield for a certain number of kilograms. Unlikely that any terrorist group could build one of those that would be really efficient. Some yield, maybe, but probably not a truly efficient yield. But the important thing to note is that the design of either one of these weapons and their manufacture, particularly the gun-type device, would require a sophisticated group of terrorists, but here's the key point, not necessarily anyone who had ever seen a nuclear weapon never mind worked on one. The key to all this and all this worry is fissile material. Where would they get fissile material? Well, they could get it, I would argue, in two different ways. One, they could get it out of leakage. Where would it leak from? By leakage, I mean no government transfers it, but rather in the leakage sub-scenario, it comes out of the country because of inadequate controls. Russia and Pakistan. Russia has far more fissile material than Pakistan, but it's better controlled than Pakistan. Not controlled adequately for us, but better controlled than Pakistan. So if you look at those two countries, there are thousands of kilograms of what I'd call inadequately secured, highly enriched uranium, and hundreds of kilograms of plutonium. So outside the weapons establishments, the world, my concern really is Russia. Inside the weapons establishments, it's Pakistan. What about the other scenario where a country actually decides it is going to transfer a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group? Is this even remotely plausible, or must this be the next action movie as well as the last 15 that I've seen? Well, before you say that's never going to happen, because I keep hearing that, think a minute. First, think Pakistan. What did Pakistan do? What did A.Q. Khan, Johnny Appleseed, do with the designs to a centrifuge and the designs to a nuclear weapon? He transferred them to Northeast Asia, to the Middle East, and elsewhere. The designs to a nuclear weapon and the technology and even some of the equipment to produce fissile material. Where did the North Korean centrifuges come from? Came from Pakistan. Where did Libya's come from? Pakistan. I can't tell you about the designs, but trust me, I'm from the government. Pakistan transferred. So don't write this off. What about Iran? Iran has provided more conventional weaponry to groups we regard as terrorists than any other country on the planet. So the Iran issue, as we can talk about that, if they have fissile material and nuclear weapons and think they won't get caught with the transfer, mightn't they? And if you still don't believe me, try this on. North Korea transferred a plutonium production reactor to Syria. Think about that, 2007, a plutonium production reactor. Not a little bit of plutonium, not a design. It built a reactor that has no other purpose other than the production of plutonium for weapons and built it in Syria. A couple of things to note about that. We didn't find it. Second, the Israelis did. If it wasn't for the Israelis and their interpretation of a non-proliferation policy, that reactor would still be operating. They squashed it. And what happened as a result? Absolutely nothing. Nobody complained. Not even the Syrians. And not even us to North Korea. So before you write off no one would purposely transfer, think about those three cases. The threat in any military scenario is always a composite of probability of the event happening and the magnitude of the consequences. The probability of what I'm talking about happening, I wouldn't say is great, but I would say that over time, it's probable. It's not easy to do, but still probable. The magnitude is very high. For those of you who haven't looked at this in a long time, roughly 3,000 people died on 9/11, and we are talking here about 2 orders of magnitude being quite plausible for the detonation of a Hiroshima or Nagasaki-sized weapon in an American city, in the order of a couple 100,000, 300,000 people. Certainly 1 order of magnitude, certainly 30,000 people. Suppose, if you can imagine 1 device, can you imagine 5 devices? Why not? If the amount of material would fit in a Coke can, somewhat a little larger but not much larger, you can imagine 5 Coke cans as easily as 1. And then think of 5 American cities and then ask what the United States of America is. And I would add the situation is worsening, not getting better. It's worsening because there's still lots of consideration of the use of plutonium fuels in the nuclear fuel cycle, particularly by China. And there may be a nuclear economy in China of extraordinary size. I would bet that there will be. South Korea would like to do that. Japan is doing some rethinking of late, but they have a plutonium reactor cycle. The French do as well. The Russians continue to talk about it. That means plutonium is in constant circulation around cities and around the country. Pakistani situation is not getting better, and the sophistication required to make these devices only is spread more every day. Second, and finally, the biological threat. We are certainly vulnerable to natural causes of pandemics. We think or should think about the flu of 1918. I still like, there are a lot of stories about the, but Gina Colada's book called Flu has a number that's really catchy. 30 to 60 million people died. 30 to 60 million people died of the flu in that period, 1918, 1919, around the world. I saw a number yesterday of 100 million, which I don't know what the basis for that is, but when we're talking those numbers, why argue? 2003, there was the severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, which could emerge again. And then there's what's currently with us and is a topic of conversation, the bird flu virus, H5N1, that could mutate naturally, but we have already jumped that hoop, and we have figured out how to mutate it in a laboratory. Yesterday's editorial in the New York Times was another plea not to do that. That gets out, and you have something that is a virus without any vaccine to deal with this, which could be catastrophic. Anthrax, you notice we never really did definitively, I don't think, solve that problem. It is for the biological weapons people, if you know any, it's their favorite agent, not because it spreads from person to person. It doesn't. It's a bacteria and it doesn't go person to person, but because it's manageable, bless you. What we worry about more is smallpox. Smallpox is a virus and is communicable. 30% lethality rate, and you may say, but we have vaccines. Well, you will be heartened to know that some folks who are not our friends have developed a smallpox strain specifically designed to be resistant to our vaccine. Very bad stuff. The hemorrhagic fevers, any number of countries have looked at hemorrhagic fevers as a biological weapon. Maybe terrorist groups, I don't know. These are Marburg and Ebola. They are over 90% lethal, and they are another cause of concern. We could go on. Those are the big ones in the world. So when I think about these kinds of threats to national security, they are relatively new, and they are of great concern in my view. So what's to be done? In terms of the traditional threat is the one remaining, really, I would say, is China, and maintaining a defense establishment, reducing nuclear weapons in a stable sort of way, addresses a relationship with Russia. But the China situation remains something which will be challenging to us. The environmental threat, international action, NGOs turn out to be very important. Nuclear terrorism, for me, the answer there is to start with developing deterrence by developing a way to identify the attacker through forensics work and other kinds of things. If we were to catch a bomb coming into the United States, we could study it and try to figure out who built it. If it's after a detonation, you should know we have people who are waiting if there's a detonation. I won't say Seattle, let's pick another town somewhere else, and that town is blown up. The people will come in, not just to help the people who are surviving, but to collect the dirt and to do the forensic analysis, and the laboratories do that in the hope of looking at the material and trying to figure out in what reactor it was produced, what kind of reactor, maybe even which one, or what technology of enrichment enriched the uranium. And if you can do that and you can tell other countries, we will find out if you transfer the material or if you're inadequately controlling it, you have some hope of recapturing deterrence. But this is a long way off, probably. Basically, for the nuclear threat, my answer is when you're, that line, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Well, the answer here is do not produce any more fissile material. Destroy the fissile material that exists. There's no need for any purpose, in my view, to have fissile material. Fissile material is either plutonium or highly enriched uranium. There's no required purpose, peaceful purpose, and we certainly don't need to build more weapons. I think in the biological area, very challenging area, mostly my view of that is public health systems and be ready for the threat. About that, I really don't have more to offer. I will tell you in closing that as a foundation, and I'm not with the US government, I'm with the MacArthur Foundation, we have adjusted our national security work to focus on these threats. That's about all I can do. And so we have, in fact, focused on fuel cycle to nuclear weapons threats. We've focused on training experts in the United States and elsewhere that will want to work on the proliferation issue. On a technical side, we're focusing on Asian security, particularly Northeast Asia, a rising China, and South Asia and Pakistan. We're looking at stability at lower levels of nuclear weapons in our arms control with Russia, and certainly we're looking at ways of preserving biodiversity on a large scale. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.
Some questions?
Absolutely.
We have some time for questions. There are microphones on either side of the hall, so if you have a question, please go up to one of those microphones and ask your question there.
My question is, the topics that you discussed tonight were very scientific, technological in nature. And what role do you see for scientists in the policymaking process and in not only in the design of certain technology, but also in comprehending what it is other actors may acquire?
If I didn't know better, I'd say that was a purposely pitched softball. But since I've was in government service a long time ago, a lot of our understanding of these issues that I've been talking about have come from people with scientific backgrounds. I don't mean just technical, I mean scientific backgrounds. So that the biological area, the chemical area, which I didn't mention because I don't think it rises quite to the level of the nuclear and biological, but the chemical area, the nuclear area, there's no way of understanding the threat, certainly of designing a response to it, even of conducting diplomacy at trying to manage it without really good technical expertise and background. And so, again, to go back to the foundation just for a moment, we have not, not been particularly active in higher education except for one area, which is to help those educational institutions that are focused particularly on the intersection of those interested in international affairs and those with a scientific or technical background, so that that cadre of people are aware for the policy community. And I mean principally the United States government, defense, state, intelligence community, but also the NGOs, also those who are writing in the think tanks. We need technically competent people. We have in the past, and I think we always will.
And if I may ask one brief follow-up. A lot of times in the process of scientific discovery, there's an emphasis on transparency and openness, which is not something that you find in areas of national security. And how do you reconcile those two paradigms?
It's very often hard because people who come out of an academic background or a scientific background where you publish run into, particularly if they go into government, a much more contracted environment in which secrecy and security is thought to be essential. I can think of lots of examples. When I first went into government, I was very interested in an area of energy known as inertial confinement fusion, ICF. And not that I had any technical expertise at all, I didn't and still don't really. The ICF people who worked in that area at places like Lawrence Livermore Labs and some others very much wanted to go and publish. And of course, they wanted to talk about the design of the pellet on which these lasers would focus. The design of the pellet would give one certain insight into the design of a thermonuclear weapon. While there isn't much of a secret, there wasn't then and there isn't now, even less about fission weapons. Fusion weapons, there actually is a secret. which has been probably mostly out there, but not entirely. And that was the first time I saw the clash of cultures, where the scientists who were working at our laboratories, Department of Energy laboratories, expected to engage colleagues on their work. Even though their work was potentially classified, and some of it was classified, they thought they could handle that. Very difficult. Take the current case. I mentioned the bird flu thing. What the New York Times was begging for is what the US government is begging for, which is that those people who went through the steps of seeing what kind of mutations would have to happen in that virus such that it would be communicable to humans, human-to-human contact, would like that not to be published. And when you try to bottle something up, particularly in a scientific establishment, it's very hard because it goes against an ethos. I don't have an easy answer to this. My view is I would because I started and have a long period in government service, I'm less worried about classification. I'm not very confident that works, but I would at this point, for example, restrict as much as possible access to this. I'll do one more case. The only case I'm aware of an effort at prior restraint occurred in a case, it's called the Progressive Magazine case, where Howard Moreland proposed to publish the design of a thermonuclear weapon. And there was an enormous clash, and I was part of the US government team trying to persuade court that we ought to exercise prior restraint in this case. Now, the case was muted because the article came out in something called the Mercury News on the West Coast, but there was a real clash about whether you could keep this secret anymore.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wonder if you would comment on the wisdom of the special relationship developed with India, the so-called 1-2-3 agreement.
Oh. I thought that was a catastrophe in terms of policy. People may not be aware of this. We did something which we thought was a terrific idea, which was to develop, we thought, a better relationship with India. Our relationship with India was vexed by a number of things, but not least of which was our inability to export nuclear equipment material to India because India was not a party to the NPT, didn't accept full-scope safeguards, and we were proponents of a rule. Remember I referred to the nuclear suppliers group before? We were proponents of a rule that said if a country it's a non-nuclear weapon state, and does not accept safeguards on all their nuclear activity, you can't export to them. So when the Chinese wanted to do it, we said no. When the Russians wanted to do it, we said no. And then, lo and behold, we decided this could be a good idea if we could have a good strategic relationship with India. So we went to change the rule, and we went in with the 1-2-3 agreement or the 1-20-23 agreement, and that was what we argued. This was in the Bush administration. I found myself on a panel of 3 before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There was a guy by the name of Biden who was chairing the committee. One of my inquisitors was a senator by the name of Obama. And I had next to me 3 people, the former Secretary of Defense, Perry, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, who is now the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and then the fellow from the administration, from the State Department, who drafted it, Ashley Tillis. All 3 of them favored the deal. I was the only person testifying against it. And for me, it undid decades of work at building up a norm against doing business with countries that were non-nuclear weapon states by the definition of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, i.e. they were not part of the initial 5, who were nonetheless wanting nuclear technology. The idea was people paid a price if they did this. That's what the deal was all along. And we violated that. We threw that under the bus so we could have a deal with India. Now, I'm sorry, but this was sort of mock Kissingerian geostrategic thinking. It was kind of, see, you got your China, you got your India, you got the United States. If we can get the United States and India, we can surround. I think this was crazy. I just think it was crazy. If a relationship with India was not going to work in a case of a contingency with China, this deal wouldn't make it work. And if it was going to work, not having the deal wouldn't stop it. I just didn't understand why we did it, and I still don't. By the way, obviously, Obama favored it, and so did Biden. I think they were both wrong.
This is a topic which you haven't addressed, but I'd like you to give a shot at it. It's cybersecurity. I've been in a number of conferences and in testimonies about cybersecurity, and I find that no one knows what to do, that they're working hard on it. I ask the question because if the digital revolution unfolds in the future, what you said about nuclear weapons and biological weapons will be in spades. Options that other countries, hackers, in obscure situations could actually get involved in. Would you care to venture into the issue of cybersecurity, because I think it may well be the biggest threat if the digital revolution unfolds in a certain way?
Cybersecurity is already an issue. Cyber attacks have already occurred, obviously by hackers, but also one government against another government. Governments don't typically say, we did it, but there are ways of finding out who did it, and governments have attacked other governments. If you attack another government using cyber assets in the midst of a conflict, it can be very destabilizing. It's very difficult to tell when you blind someone what they will do. There's a metaphor to anti-satellite activity, where you either make your adversary blind by taking out satellites so he can't see what you're doing, or you hinder their communications in some way. Countries may strike out in this way as a result of that because they can't be sure of what's happening. The same thing in the cyber world. I would more specifically say that the discussion of cyber is almost always, right now, in the open literature, a very misleading enterprise. Even if you took the best big study I know of, the National Academy study, if you look at that, you'll find there's virtually nothing on offense. The study is virtually entirely focused on the vulnerability of advanced societies, complex societies, whether it's their banking, communications, power, to the cyber networks. What you're not reading about is offensive capability from us. And when you try to figure out why certain deals aren't struck or that, there's a reason for that. If you asked the best people I know, who are the best cyber people on the planet, it really is not the Chinese necessarily at all, notwithstanding some views that they are. It's probably us in terms of offense. Nobody is going to say more than that. Even on a classified basis, very little is said about that. This is a very black part of our capability. I think I'm pretty safe ground by saying we have offensive cyber capability. That is not a secret. But to understand the dynamic right now in terms of that I've been talking today about our security, you have to understand the trade-off here, because the fellow responsible for cybersecurity knows a lot about what we want to be free to do. And he's not going to be wildly enthusiastic about restraining others if it also restrains us.
Mr. Secretary, I would like to point out an error that you made.
Only one?
In my view, the United Nations Special Commission on Iraq And then the next commission that Richard Butler headed, I forget its name, and then the one that Hans Blix headed, UNMAVIC, actually succeeded. It turns out that Saddam Hussein did not have biological weapons, did not have nuclear weapons. And that may have verified a point that you were making intermittently, which is that another revolution has occurred. These systems for remote sensing, monitoring, inspection, and verification, when combined with sort of diplomatic agreements that you negotiated, have created this great security revolution as the nuclear weapons and the missiles.
Absolutely right, and I really did a hell of a job. No, and as we used to say on Long Island, in all seriousity, I think that UNSCOM did some good stuff. UNMOVIC did some good stuff. And as it turned out, in a way, it wasn't enough, that there were ambiguities. I have to tell you that, and I carry this like an albatross around my neck, that I read the key report done by the intelligence community about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and I read it as a member of the advisory group for the Director of Central Intelligence, at the time, George Tenet. And I was supposed to, as an outsider, pick up that which was inaccurate in it. And the parts that said that Iraq had almost certainly regenerated its chemical and biological weapons, I found perfectly acceptable and posed no objection, and even testified before the United States Senate the summer before the invasion. The nuclear part I thought was crazy, and I said this is crazy. And I also said that we shouldn't invade a country because of chemical or biological weapons, because we'd be really busy if we invented every country that had that. But there wasn't any evidence of nuclear weapons. But I would say that in defense of my horseback ride through my own career, that I felt failure in that. Nevertheless, I wished that we could have wrapped that up. It wasn't simply a failure of UNSCOM, or certainly not of Hans Blix. I mean, Blix was not allowed to do what he wanted to do. He wanted to do really good inspections. And the problem was that the administration was really not interested in demonstrating sort of unambiguously that there really was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. So, there's enough blame to go around here. And if I can be exonerated from any, I would love it. Thank you.
We'll just take those 3 questions,
Okay.
and we'll be the end.
Thank you. I was wondering, in the context of international institution building to contain nuclear proliferation, it seems that a major factor that does not seem to have a lot of meaningful discussion in mainstream media or in policy circles, at least that I've been able to see, is the question of China. They sit in the middle of a lot of proliferation hotspots. They are a key ally of Iran, they are a key ally of North Korea, and they are right now in the midst of this nuclear renaissance that you mentioned. So when it comes to, I suppose, reading the tea leaves in Beijing and deciphering the factions within the Chinese Communist Party, what do you think the dominant forces are there, and what do you think can be done to bring them around on an international solution to the problem of nuclear proliferation?
First, I don't have any real special insight into decision-making in China, and you have people at the Jackson School who can actually bring some intelligent comment to that, and I'm not one of them. What I would say is that I don't regard China as a particular problem with respect to traditional or national proliferation. I think they have generally been helpful in the North Korea case. In the last administration, they were extremely helpful, and our policy wasn't terrific, but they really would like to have removed that threat, I think, from North Korea. The Iranian connection is more, I think, to do with a hostility generally to international sanctions. They really don't like sanctions on others because they don't want them on themselves and don't want the international organization imposing sanctions, but less because they're a supporter of Iran. I don't mean they don't have deals with Iran, but I don't think that's the problem with Iran. And I think if I was going to point my finger at China in any way with respect to proliferation, it would be with respect to Pakistan. I mean, one would ask a number of questions about where Pakistan got certain things, and which I really can't talk about, but certain of those things came from China. And so, but that was then and this is now. I don't think that's been a recent phenomenon to the best of my knowledge. So I don't see China as in traditional proliferation terms. However, you do mention something which I really wanted to get everybody to kind of look at, and I went over it fairly quickly. If I look around the world and I'm concerned about the nuclear terrorism thing, I'm concerned about fissile material. And right now, the country that is not going to be deploying view graphs of reactors, but building real reactors, is China, I think. And what fuel cycle they pick is absolutely critical. And right now, they're getting information from the French. The French are the leading proponents, particularly Arriva, of the use of plutonium fuels in thermal reactors, the current generation of light water reactors. The most dangerous concept in a fuel cycle I can imagine. Well, apart from maybe breeders, but we may get that too. So I'm very concerned about China in that connection, and less so as a source of transfer, as compared maybe even with the Iranian case, what the French were doing and what the Russians were doing. And North Korea has already, that boat has sailed, right?
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could comment on the Obama administration's ramping up of economic sanctions against Iran and whether you believe that that's still an effective strategy.
Whether that is still an effective strategy. I am reading that the Iranians are being hurt by sanctions, and I'm prepared to believe that. But that really is not the test, is it? The test is what they do with their nuclear program as a result of the sanctions. So I'm not yet persuaded, and I haven't seen any evidence that indicates that what we've done with respect to sanctions, which is really quite extensive, that effort has produced any impact on the Iranian decision-making with respect to its nuclear weapons program. To the best of my knowledge, that weapons program, the part of the program that really goes to weapons, the triggering package work has gone on, it's continued to go on. The effort to multiply the number of places in which they can enrich uranium, maybe initially to 3 or 20%, but to higher degrees of enrichment in the isotope U-235. There's probably a number of other places. So I don't see the impact of this. And if the test is, which I think it ought to be at least part of the test, are you or y'all prepared to accept Iran as a nuclear weapon state? Either an overt nuclear weapon state that steps out the way North Korea did and says we are going to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty out of that and take the withdrawal clause from the treaty, or in a more sotto voce way by just strongly having it known, suggested elsewhere, that they have in fact enriched to high levels, unbeknownst to the IAEA. And by the way, there is nothing about enriching to high levels that is intrinsically illegal for a state to do. That's one of the problems with the NPT and the IAEA, as long as they do it under safeguards. So they can be very close to nuclear. There's a lot of scenarios here. The question is, what are we prepared to accept before we decide we need to intervene, or before the Israelis decide they need to intervene? I don't know how you all assess this. Intervention would not be cheap, and it may not be effective in a military sense. However, just simply saying, okay, we've lost one again, Iran, may not be cheap either. So I think this is a very hard case. I don't yet see, I think the thing that bothers me is the idea that, well, we'll go with sanctions. Excuse me, but I think you ought to look that in the face and say sanctions are not going to stop this program. And you should, I think it would be a more honest thing to do in a policy sense. If I was writing the paper inside government, let's make a choice and understand right now that there isn't anything that's going to stop this program other than the use of force. And we want to make a decision about whether we would ultimately use force. And then if that decision is yes, we might be able to lever certain activity as a result of that. Otherwise, if the answer is no, we're not going to use force, okay, then we try to mitigate the program as best we can, limit its size, make sure the model isn't the Pakistan model. Okay? That would be how I'd look at it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Gallucci. I'm going to have to apologize because I'm going to make a simple assumption about the future of the global energy supply, and that is that we are going to need nuclear energy as part of it. That being said, there's concern about the limited supply of uranium and how far that will extend. If that's the case, then one way to extend it is through the use of reprocessing. Would you accept that as a condition for a state to have fissile material?
Absolutely not. I don't and have never seen good evidence that we're going to run out of uranium. The more uranium we use, the bigger the figure that defines uranium reserves, not unlike other natural resources. Because as soon as the price goes up, as soon as people start to use more of it, there's more exploration, and you get more of the material. I don't think there's a real credible argument we'd run out of uranium in this century, even with rather extraordinary projections of nuclear power growth, which I think are not going to come true. What you have, I think, is a kind of argument that sounds like yours. And there are variations on this theme. And the argument is, well, we're running out of uranium. There's all that plutonium value in the fuel. We can save separative work units and enrichment, and we can save uranium by burning the plutonium. And I would say nonsense. It is not economically desirable. It's not economically necessary. And it's extremely dangerous. So use uranium. The other argument that always goes along with this is, how do you handle radioactive waste? I know, let's reprocess the spent fuel and we treat the waste in some kind of way in which we vitrify it and send it away. Reprocessing produces more waste, not less. And, by the way, you can treat the spent fuel as waste or simply store it in cement canisters, which is what the U.S. Commission came down and is recommending. Not reprocessing either for resource requirements or for waste management, but storage of spent fuel and ultimately disposal. Makes perfect sense to me. The problem is your argument becomes a rationale for countries that really shouldn't be reprocessing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think you will agree with me that Bob earned that long introduction I gave him. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your lecture and your conversation. Thank you.